this next installation of Coffee Chat Readiness. So this is the fourth one, I think, that we've done. You can go find the rest on Leland. You can also find them on our YouTube channel. We'll be posting those as well in a playlist. So this is a very important question. It is the most common question that you will get in investment banking. It is to tell me about yourself. And this is a question that you really should be coming in with pretty much fully scripted and having a clean answer to. That is kind of the expectation. Some of the wording, maybe goes a little bit differently, like in the same way like an actor rehearsing a scene, like when they actually do the scene, it may go a little bit differently than they planned it. But the expectation is that you're going to have a nicely structured, coherent story to explain yourself and bring yourself to the present moment. Most people, it's going to be obvious to them how to just list things that they've done that brings the person up to the present moment. But what is unfortunate for a lot of you that, despite having AI and all these other things, you will need to have sort of a literary lens in telling a story, in telling a good story. There is a way for you to dump a bunch of information on someone, and then there is a way to tell a story where you are an empathetic, interesting protagonist that they want to be involved with. So you're going to, you do all your technical prep. I'm sure all of you're going on Offer Goblin, you're drilling technicals, you're getting all this ready. These series are kind of about building out these critical questions that open the door to being able to show your technicals. So I work with a lot of clients on this very common service, and I do a 90-minute session with people where we go back and forth. We do this very long interview, and we kind of get down into really what their motivation were at different points and why they made certain decisions along the way. If that sounds like something that would be helpful for you, feel free to book an intro call, especially helpful for people who have irregular backgrounds or maybe you're late to recruitment, that sort of thing. Very common. So the resume, as we talked about in the first episode, really lists what you did, right? And they will have a copy right in front of them for the most part. Your goal of the story is to create a character that is going through those bullet points and giving sort of reason to why you did those things and how you got to them. One thing I'll throw in really quickly, and I've been doing this on every live stream, if you can message, if you're undergrad, grad, MBA, and lateral, which process you're recruiting for, it helps me kind of know that I'm actually reaching anyone, that I'm not on mute or something. So feel free to do that in the chat. And the other thing I'll throw in there is if you have any questions at any time, just feel free to toss them in and I will address them in time. So you're trying to say in your story who you are, what has changed, and why banking is next. There's really like five. I always use this sort of spreadsheet to do these, and there's 5 slots in that spreadsheet, and it should be like a 60 to 90 second thing. It's pretty quick. So at the end of this, or towards the end of this session, I'll give you my actual story, the one that I use at Centerview. It's Interview at Catalyst and Goldman and all those firms, start to finish. So, all right. So for those of you that are new, my name is Michael. I'm the founder of Offer Goblin. It is the flashcard tool for investment banking technicals. It's been incredible to start this company a year ago, and we've grown so much, especially in the last couple of weeks. All of you should go check that out and get your hands on it. If you want to message me, you can follow us on any of the socials, and I can give you whatever a free week or something like that. So follow us on social media at Offer Goblin, Instagram, TikTok, all that. I am also one of the top experts on Leland and customer favorite. I work with a ton of clients doing this kind of stuff, getting into elite boutiques from all kinds of backgrounds, elite boutiques and bulge brackets, tech. I've done people getting into restructuring and all sorts of other things. So, all right. So let's jump into what this answer is actually for. So there's going to be kind of 3 parts to this. First is we're going to talk about what this answer is for. What is the purpose of the tell me about yourself. The second is the way that it's actually structured, or the way that I like to structure it, which kind of gives like a literary angle to it, I guess. And then the last is sort of like how it gets you cut, or like what issues you could have, what things you can run into. So, all right. So what is a good answer? What is the purpose of this answer? On Tuesday, we on I think that the thing is that on Tuesday we covered that the tell me about yourself is really something that gets covered in the first 5 minutes of almost every conversation that you'll have in investment banking. So it's incredibly important that you land this well so that you start that conversation out right. Maybe you seed some questions that you maybe would want to talk about or answer. You kind of address maybe some issues that they might have thought of that, you kind of get to those beforehand. For example, well, how come you don't have any prior finance internships? Why are you changing from this field into that field? You can kind of nip some of those in the bud. And it's an incredibly important question that pays a lot of dividends. It's worth the time and effort to invest in this. They already have your resume. So you don't need to go in and summarize your resume. A lot of times they'll be holding it in their hands and reading it while they're talking to you or having it on their screen, or maybe they won't even look at it at all. What you're doing is narrating a document so that they can understand you and understand why you did all those things. So I'm going to give you the example from my end. I worked at Deloitte. My background is incredibly unusual, very irregular in many, many different ways. It is a pile of things. And this is how I told my story to get into investment banking, to get an offer at Centerview. So I started out in civil engineering. I did construction management. I've done structural engineering. I worked on the most expensive building in the city of Chicago. I worked at a unicorn startup doing manufacturing in Phoenix. I then went to Deloitte. I worked in cloud strategy. I worked for the Olympic Games. I worked for some of the largest tech companies. Then I've come to Booth. I did the MBA and Masters in Computer Science in Centerview, and then I dropped out. I started my own company. There's a lot of different things going on here, and it's very difficult if I just list them the way that I just did. That's not a story. That's me listing to you the things that I've done, but it doesn't tell you why I did those things. It doesn't tell you how those things have built upon each other and why all of them make sense. It just opens up a lot of questions. It doesn't create a narrative. So if I'm reading that as a list, nobody really cares about that. I mean, nobody really finds that to be as interesting. What you'll need to do is to tie that all together. So let's see. The version that I guess now actually probably is a good time to just give you the story so that you can compare it to what I just said. So what I just said is sort of the stumbled list of all of these random things that I've done. Here is the actual story that I used to get into Centerview. So my name is Michael. I'm an MBA and Masters in Computer Science at UChicago. Before that, I was at Deloitte for 4 years in cloud strategy. While I was there, my role was to help CTOs and CIOs make investment decisions about technology infrastructure. As a part of that, one of the businesses that I worked with was a large tech company that had acquired a startup, and we were involved in the integration process. So I got to see how this small startup suddenly had this huge influx of capital and how that completely changed their operations. It improved their product a ton. And not only that, but all of the clients of the large company were suddenly able to buy this product, and a huge cross-sell, a huge boost in revenue. And I became really interested in this idea that mergers and acquisitions could completely transform economic landscapes. So the first thing that I did is I read Ray Dalio's Principles. I started to listen to Bloomberg and read the Wall Street Journal. And I realized that I wanted to have a career in investment banking. So I came to UChicago to study finance in the MBA program. I also wanted to keep my foot in the door with technicals and have that kind of continued knowledge. So I did the Masters in Computer Science. And now I'm applying to technology banking roles such as this one. And I'm hoping to begin my career in investment banking at this firm. So that answer is an answer that creates a person. You can kind of imagine me going through and doing those things and seeing those specific things and how that leads into me reaching this doorstep where I have these experiences. Whereas when I just kind of dump all of the experiences out, it doesn't really give you that tale. For MBAs, your story is probably going to be something very similar to that. And the reason is that you kind of by definition, for the most part, are sort of pivoting from something you were doing before into something you're doing now. The question is always like, well, why didn't you go into investment banking right out of undergrad? And so the MBA story is usually has a little bit of a little more of a turning point, a little more dramatic of a turning point where you realize that this was something that you wanted to do. On the other hand, you have undergrads, and the undergrad story is typically a little bit more straightforward just because there's just less experiences. That said, it's not totally obvious because a lot of undergrads, they didn't necessarily come in to do finance right away. They maybe came into finance later on. And so, there is still, I still structure them both the same way. And the reason is that there is still some point in your history where you weren't planning on going into investment banking or you weren't thinking about it. Then you learned about it, realized you wanted to do it. And that's when you sort of advanced into the mode that you're in, right? So let's talk now about how to actually structure that story. Like, what are the elements of that story? And I've given you that example so we can kind of ground some of this in that. I always think of it in 5 parts, and this is like the classic hero's journey for those of you who have read any books. So the 5 steps are this. First is the setup. Second is the challenge. Third is the turning point. Fourth is the resolution. And 5 is the future path. So the way that I lay this out is I put it in a table where I have like sort of each row is one of those bullet points, one of those lines. So starting out with the setup. The setup is very straightforward, and this is the part where you just need to dump certain information. My name is this. I'm at this school. I'm a sophomore. I'm a incoming MBA. There's certain things that you just need to state and get out of the way. Do not be creative here. There's no need to be creative. This is just to introduce the details of who you are so they kind of have that framed up. The second slot is the challenge. So this is some kind of a friction point or something that you were doing where you saw something or there was some kind of hardship or there was something that interested you and you kind of felt like, oh, there's something there. There's something there that I want to solve. There's some kind of conflict in a way. So like for my story, it's like, well, I'm going into this, I'm doing all of this, CTO advisory, but then I'm seeing that there's like this crazy other thing that's happening. Well, like, and I wanted to understand it. It's like, why is that happening? That's where that sort of challenge takes in. And keep in mind that that challenge and that turning point, which we'll talk about the turning point next, it should be specific. It should be like a sort of real moment that you could point to. It shouldn't be like, I think the way to think about that is like, it's like, if I were to just say, well, I went to Deloitte and then I realized I wanted to do M&A, so then I did this. That doesn't really give you, first of all, it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like that's actually what happened. It also just doesn't really characterize you as a person. It doesn't humanize you. That kind of puts you as you're not a character in that story. That's just you saying something. That's not you telling a story. So the challenge kind of gets laid down as some specific thing that you saw. You saw this happen with undergrad. Sometimes it's like, my dad was in finance and I saw him on the phone doing deals and I thought, what are you doing? Can you tell me about that? I worked with a client where her dad helped to explain real estate to her. And then it was like, oh, well, now that's kind of where the origin was. It was like, I remember I sat down and he explained to me the real estate market. So that gets into the next. So the challenge is sort of framing that up. The turning point is like the actual moment where you were like, I'm going to go all in. I actually want to do this now. So this is a lot of times that you need to name that specific moment where you're like, now I'm going to go all in. There is always a turning point. Like no one was born wanting to go into investment banking. I'm sorry to say it, but at some point you were playing with action figures or dolls, and then you decided to go in. There was a moment. And ideally you can kind of point to that moment, or even in some ways you make that moment up a little bit, but it's like, there was that moment in my story where I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. What happened there? I want to research that. And then I decided, I want to go into M&A. So you want to name that like class, you want to name that book, you want to name that job, that deal, that thing that tipped it in, because again, those details make it more memorable and they make it more believable, because that name, it's sort of more like checkable, right? It exists a little bit more. No one's going to check it, obviously, but that's, the point. So the resolution is the next step. So we've done the setup. My name is this, blah, blah, blah. I was doing this. I saw this thing. That's when I realized I wanted to go into investment banking. Resolution. So what steps have you taken to get there? A lot of people have not done very many, which is, if you're hearing this, you should try to build some of those things up. Ideally, you can point to, so I took an Excel workshop. So I did this pitch competition. So I joined this finance club. Falsifiable things that are costly signals. So the idea of a costly signal it's a biological term. What that means is that it's something that for you to do it, it would have been so expensive that no one would have done it had they not had full right intention. So like, for example, dating, right? If you're dating someone, for most of us, you wouldn't go take someone to a $200 dinner unless you were really serious and committed to them. That's a costly signal that you could not do that with everyone. I mean, at least maybe all of you can't. Ha ha ha. No, I can't either. But suffice to say that the point of those things is to show that you're truly dedicated to investment banking. So in this resolution stage, you're going to state ideally 3 things, maybe more. In my story, this is, the strongest part of it is that I'm coming to an MBA program. That's the costly signal that most lateral hires do. What could add to it, for example, would be, so I took this modeling course. So I took this, I joined this finance club. I did these steps that are so hard to do that someone who wasn't serious wouldn't have done them or couldn't have done them. And the more advanced that those are, the more costly that those are, the better it looks on the better it reflects onto you. So oftentimes I'm working with clients to try to build those out. Ideally, you build those out as early as you can. For tech, for example, there's a ton of tech certifications. There's a ton of certifications you can get for really anything. So, okay, so the future path, that's the last step here, that's really just stating, it kind of closes this thing out. It's like, why the specific group, why the specific banker role is next. So for me, it's like, so that's why I'm recruiting for technology investment banking in the West Coast. And I think that Centerview is the place where I would start my career in investment banking. And you'll notice that like you ideally want to close it like pretty strong. Like that's why I want to join Centerview's investment banking practice, as opposed to like being vague, like, and yeah, that's why I'm excited to be here. Or like, and yeah, that's why I'm excited. It's like, you want to land that like pretty solid. People tend to remember, in general, they tend to remember the highest emotional point and the end of something. There's a book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I've mentioned it a million times. It's probably the most important psychology book that you can read, at least in my opinion. So, all right. So you're going to get through this, right? You're going to get through your story and you're going to stop. The story needs to be 60 to 90 seconds. And you're going to fight me on this because you have so many details and you're so special and you want to include all these things, but you really cannot do that. The problem is that if you just keep rambling on, the rest of what you're going to say is not going to be remembered. You need to say enough that you hit the right signals, but not so much that you dilute those signals down such that someone, is just bored and doesn't want to hear from you anymore. So it's a art form and it's very difficult. That is communication 101. Most of the time, that is the case. Like with almost every client I've worked with, I think that I have always cut down their story. I don't think anyone had a story where I'm like, this story is too short. It's almost always, we're going to restructure this whole thing and it's going to be a lot shorter. And then a lot of times when I'm like, okay, here's your story, make any like minor adjustments that you want to it, they often add to it and kind of ruin it. So that's a, significant piece of advice there. So we'll go into the third act here. The how it gets you cut. These are kind of the things to look out for when you're giving your tell me about yourself in an investment banking interview. So first of all, once you've gotten your story together, whatever it is, tell your story, tell your investment banking interview story to someone else, to someone who doesn't know about investment banking, who doesn't care, and see when they get bored and see what parts that they get bored at, because those are probably boring parts that you need to cut out. You're probably adding too much. You're probably rambling on. You need a tight, simple story that someone could digest and understand. It's always a good idea to think of the person that you're talking to in an investment banking recruitment context as sleep deprived. A sleep deprived person is going to be very bored of what you are going to be saying. So you need to kind of cut those things down and try to make it interesting. So another thing is that this is like so funny because this is like what our English teachers told us in high school every time we'd write something. Show, don't tell. You need to show that you are these things. You need to show that you are, let's say, analytical or a team player or whatever, and not tell. You can't say, I'm really analytical. What you can say is in your story, I mean, for me, based on like me saying I'm working with CTOs, I'm helping them make data center investment decisions. That's clearly like I'm stating something that would tell you that I'm analytical. If there's someone else that could say like, well, you can bring out aspects of things that you did in that story that say that. You don't really want to say like, I did this because I'm analytical. You want to show and don't tell. Adjectives don't land. Actions land. You are actions. You are not how you describe yourself. And that's a little bit of philosophy for you on Thursday evening. So the character, you are a character in the story, and that character is a verb. It is doing things. So you should sound like someone that would get into banking. Your investment banking, tell me about yourself, is the story of a character who gets into investment banking at the end of the story. That's the completion of the arc. And you telling them that should make them want to let you in because they're like, oh, you're on this arc and I want to help you complete the arc. Like naturally, it makes sense. So here are 6 ways that people make mistakes in their investment banking. Tell me about yourself. The first one is you read your resume out loud. Your story should not be just a list of things that you've done. It should be an actual narrative story. 2, there's no turn. There is never someone who always wanted to be a banker. There was some moment when you realized that you wanted to be a banker, and pointing to that moment helps people understand your motivation and your journey to getting there. 3 is that you answer your why banking a little too much. You go a little too far into why investment banking. You will get that follow-up. Pretty much no matter what you say, they will follow up with why banking. You want to cover a little bit of that here, but not all of it. 4th is that your story could apply to consulting, or it could apply to private equity, or it could apply to tech. Your story needs to be specific to banking. The things that you're saying motivate you and the things that you are interested in should be as specific as possible to investment banking and not be applicable to other fields. Number 5 is that it never lands. It goes on and on. It's like 4+ minutes and you never really land the plane and say, so, that's why I'm here. That's why I want to start my career at this firm. And number 6 is that there's nobody in it. There's no details in it. There's no schools or jobs. There's no person. There's no specific detail in there that lets anyone kind of attach themselves to your humanity, to your story, to develop empathy for you. And if you can correct those 6 things and you can follow this structure, you will be able to tell a good story. Whether they hire you or not, they will understand you and they will empathize with you and humanize you, which is what you need to happen. All right. Okay. So here are 2 things that you are probably mostly thinking if you've heard this up to this point. First of all, that your turning point is boring. So that the thing that like the moment that you realize for a lot of people, for example, is like, well, I got to freshman year, second semester, and I realized that everybody else was recruiting for investment banking. I have succumbed to mimetic desire. I am desiring what others desire because they desire it, which could be true. You need to kind of figure out an angle to tell that story a little more interesting. So you need to find, okay, well, everybody else wanted to do this. At some point, you must have looked into it yourself. There must be some little piece of this that interests you, and it's different for everyone. If we were to talk a little more about why banking, which I think we will do maybe next week or the week after, there are really simple cardinal reasons why most people get into banking. And you need to kind of figure out which one applies to you. For some people, it's curiosity. For some people, it's the impact. Some people are interested in the intensity of the job. Some people love the client service aspect. That should sort of come out in your turning point. That turning point should be sort of tied to that intrigue. For me, it was curiosity, as you might guess, based on the idea that I saw something, I didn't understand it, I wanted to understand it more, and I became very curious about it. So the second thing that a lot of people are probably thinking is that their background has nothing to do with banking, that they really have not done anything related to banking. That can be an advantage in some ways. For MBAs, it's very common. And there are a lot of straight line candidates. That's a candidate who basically from high school knew they wanted to go into investment banking. They went to a target school because they wanted to do that. They don't have a lot to explain. And that's great. A lot of those people, like you do very well because that's, it's straightforward. But you can use your story. Your story can you can create intrigue with your story. So when it comes to like, for example, MBAs and even undergrads as well, like you can be bringing a unique perspective. So there were people at Centerview, for example, who were history majors. There were physics majors. There were people from all kinds of different backgrounds. One of the people that I helped to get into Centerview last year or 2 years ago was a quantum physics major. It's like totally not related. So, your background, but what's important is that like you need to tell a good story about like how you even ended up in this room and how this ties into your future plans and all of that. So, okay. So, any questions thus far? Some examples of what, if I may clarify? Some examples of it. Tell me about yourself. Yeah. Okay. I'll just, I'll kind of just, I guess I'll just invent some. I don't want to dox people. So here are a few examples of a good, tell me about yourself. I'll do Jamie Dimon when he was, let's say, coming out of school. So, hi, my name is Jamie Dimon. I've been a consultant for several years. Hi, my name is Jamie Dimon. I'm a Harvard MBA. I was a consultant for several years before that. Getting into the operations of business, I got to understand kind of the ins and outs of different types of businesses. While I was there, I saw the news about Nabisco being acquired, and I was really fascinated by that story. I found myself reading the news all the time to learn more about it. I realized that, I felt like I would find a very interesting path in investment, in finance, and specifically in investment banking, in helping to advise firms on these sell-side processes. So I started to study for my GMAT. I got into Harvard Business School. I then, let's see, what else would Jamie Dimon have done? I took a weekend workshop to learn the modeling. I don't even know exactly how they did modeling back then, to be honest. And now I'm here to apply to Goldman Sachs and for a summer internship. That would be a good story. That would be a good, like, tight, simple story that explains Jamie Dimon's background. By the way, Jamie Dimon was an MBA. He did intern at Goldman. And when he left, he went to American Express because he wanted to work under a particular mentor. So I know that many of you are probably very interested in prestige, but it's actually really important that when you go and do these coffee chats, that you connect with people and that you find people who are going to invest in your career as in sort of a mentor leadership capacity. So one of the other things that I think that ties into, that kind of brings me to, is that you telling your story, it should also, and I mentioned kind of you telling your story and humanizing yourself. It's like, you want them to understand you because, like, you want to create this like two-way relationship where you are like, they know like your journey into this and that they are bought in and they want to invest in you. The sale doesn't really stop at the offer. Many of you will get investment banking offers. You might even get multiple investment banking offers, and you still need to always be selling. You're selling, I mean, yes, you're selling the return offer, whatever, but more so if you want to have a successful career, what you need to do is have people who are above you, who are further along than you, invest in you, believe in you, and understand you. And so you're telling your story, and you're defining this character, and what you want is for them to adhere to that character, and you can kind of see, like, do they like this kind of character? Will they invest in this kind of character, or do I really have no place here? A lot of what will make or break your career, especially in corporation, is going to be those people above you. So keeping all of that in mind, like them truly understanding your story and what they're buying into, is a really good way for you to get the beginnings of that relationship. All right. Any other questions? I'll also throw in another tag for, you can book a call with me. You can book a 15-minute intro call and send your resume and some details about yourself. If you want to do a story session, but also, like, I think it's usually more useful if you actually just book an intro call and we just talk about like where you are with things and like what to work on. But the 90-minute story building session that I do is very popular for a reason. I'm going to get into some like rapid fire Q&A stuff that I wrote down here. These are common questions that people often have. And again, feel free to throw in your questions in the chat. So first of all, different story for different groups or different roles. Sometimes, mostly not. Mostly the setup and the challenge and mostly you kind of switch out like one line of that, which is usually like the turning point. It could be a little bit like, so let's say you were going to interview for private credit and investment banking. Like, a lot of that is going to be the same. I think in the challenge stage, instead of saying, like, for me, if I was going to say that, instead of saying, well, I was a part of this acquisition and integration, I might say like, well, I got to see how like the, credit flowed into this business. And from that, I wanted to go into private credit because it seems like the most interesting version of financing. That then kind of the rest of the story is mostly the same, because ideally you don't want to be practicing like so many different stories. It's going to be hard for you to juggle those in your mind. You want to just kind of switch out like one block of the script rather than coming up with all these different stories where you're going to have trouble balancing them. Second thing is whether to mention or justify certain like negative things. So like a low GPA or a bad semester, or sometimes people talk about a gap year, which a gap year isn't a bad thing. It's more that like, you don't really need to break yourself into jail. In consulting is the master class of these terms, like corporate terms. And one of my favorites from one of the leaders there was, don't break yourself into jail. Don't bring up stuff that you don't want to talk about. Sometimes, you're going to justify why you went from theater to investment banking, yes, but you don't need to bring up like, oh, and then I got arrested. Hopefully you didn't get arrested, but you know what I mean? You don't need to bring up those details in the story. You want to use that time effectively. Can my turning point be in high school? Can it be as a kid? Yes. And I think a lot of times that's very common for undergrads, that they realize that they wanted to do something in finance in high school. So yes, your turning point can be in high school. Your turning point could be when you were a little child. I think it's hilarious or funny. I worked with one client where, maybe he's here, I'm not sure, but I worked with one client where one of his early experiences was he invested some money with his dad when he was like 12 years old, and he didn't know what he was doing, but he made some money doing that. And that's kind of what exposed him to finance in the first place. So that can be, it can start anywhere. And that's also a very endearing story to think about a young lad betting on the stock market. What if they interrupt me? That can happen. They can interrupt you, especially if you're going on too long. Sometimes they'll interrupt you and press you in these interviews, honestly. It can happen. So expect that and be ready to move on. Sometimes they might just be like, I've heard enough. So the key here is that you want to answer what you're asked and you want to kind of move on from this. You don't need to spend, in the interview process, they're asking questions and they kind of want to like move it forward. They don't necessarily want to linger on for too long. There's kind of this, okay, I don't know how, I feel like I'm making a lot of literary references in this episode for some reason, but there's a book called Infinite Jest, and it's about tennis, right? And they talk about tennis as an analogy for a lot of things. And one of those things, for example, would be conversation. You're kind of hitting the ball back and forth from one side of the court to the other between you and them. And to be a good conversationalist, or at least to be a good interviewer, you need to be returning those serves like somewhat promptly. So when you get that serve, when they serve it to you, tell me about yourself, whack. You gotta like I'm Michael, I'm from Chicago MBA. Like, you don't want to linger. You're not trying to like hold the ball forever. You're trying to like hit the ball back and like have this like back and forth conversation. So like, for the most part, you shouldn't be speaking for more than like almost like 2 minutes at a time. Like, it's volleying back and forth, unless they like clearly they want you to and they're like pushing you to. But ideally, you're kind of going back and forth. It's a little more engaging for them, a little more fun. How do I not sound rehearsed? This is a very common thing because you will rehearse this a ton and you will probably have an exact script. I think that one of the ways is that, at least for me, when I say it, I kind of know the beats of the story in my mind. And based on that, I'm kind of freestyling through almost like I'm reading a slide. So that way it kind of feels a little bit more organic, as opposed to, I don't try to recite word for word the whole thing, but I know what the beats are. So I know that I need to get to like the next beat, and I can tell like, oh, I'm dragging on this beat. It's going a little too long. Last one, and then I'll answer some questions in the chat. Can I use ChatGPT? Yes, I would say as a starting point. Honestly, you could probably use it for a lot of it. I think the core challenge a lot of times is that ChatGPT is a very one-directional communication. It's not going to do as good of a job to interview and truly understand you in the way that it would come out well for an investment banking interview. And by that, I mean that when I work with candidates, we spend a long time, like probably the first 30 minutes of a 90-minute session, where I'm just asking them questions. I'm like, well, where were you when this happened? What did you do after that? And why did you do this? And it's really that part of it that I think is the most valuable part, which is like that introspection. And ChatGPT can certainly help you write that, but I think you'll have trouble for it to recognize what things make the most interesting story of you. Why are you an interesting character? That's kind of where you need, well, you don't need, but that's where it helps to have like a second person, essentially like an author like me, to write your tale. Okay, I'm an MBA graduate with several years of real estate financial analysis experience. I'm looking to transition into private equity / real assets. How would you recommend introducing myself and connecting with people in PE? Also, do your career coach cover this type of transition? Yes. And I do private equity as well. I've done other like also unusual financial jobs, all kinds of strange things like audit and other things. But I would say that if you're transitioning, you're lateraling, regardless, the story is still the same. In fact, this story structure applies to tech. It applies to any other industry that you're going into because it's just simply how to tell a good story. So I think it's useful to do this type of introspection. I remember when I was doing my MBA and I was doing my essays, I found it very useful to have thought about how I got here and why and write it all down. I found that to be one of the most valuable experiences. And I remember writing those essays and thinking like, I would want to have written this essay regardless of whether this was for business school or not. I would encourage you to think about your tell me about yourself in that way, because it's an introspective way for you to sort of define yourself, to think about where you are, to think about where you're going and why. And so whether you're doing private equity and real estate or you're doing some other thing, the tell me about yourself is still going to be the same. Okay, so that's all the time that we have. I'll take some extra questions if people have some more, but feel free to book time with me if you want some advice on kind of what to do next or where you're going. Get on Offer Goblin and drill your technicals, get those together. You should not be falling behind on that. You can follow me on social media at Offer Goblin on YouTube. We'll post a bunch of these episodes. I have a bunch of other episodes that I do on different investment banking topics. And with that said, yeah, we have another one next Tuesday. You can register for all of those on my page. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.